Hey everyone, just picking up right where we just left off if you were watching the other lecture, although hopefully you gave yourself a break. Before I move on, I forgot to mention why I put this picture of a cat on a TV right now, and that's because mood management theory, which again is all about how people use media subconsciously to make themselves feel better, explains why we like cat videos, right? So if you find yourself scrolling on TikTok, watching a bunch of animal videos or Instagram or whatever, there's actually been research by a friend of mine at Penn State that looks at how cat videos are used as a mood management technique. So the more you know, right? Okay, so we are going to move on. So just to sort of contextualize everything in the last lecture, which again is part of this overall slide package, we talked about positive unintended effects of the media. And we're going to end the semester on a really happy note, I guess. And we're going to be talking about all of these like negative effects of the media. But I want to put the negative effects in some context here because I think I've mentioned at some other time during the semester that whenever there's a new technology or a new type of media that comes out, society does tend to have what we call moral panic about it, where because we're nervous about whatever the new thing is, people always sort of assume that like the worst is going to happen. It's very doomsday. It's very like, here's a great example. Like it used to be when the Walkman, do you know what a Walkman is? I mean, think about like an old cassette player where people would walk around with headphones and listen to their music. People were so upset that was going to disconnect us from other people because we're going to be walking around and we're going to have the world blocked out. And that's an example of sort of like a moral panic where we always assume that the worst about what influence a new technology is going to have. And this is nothing new. We've been having book burnings throughout the ages because people are scared of what sort of content effects there's going to be. We don't want people to be influenced. Everybody's so simple out there, and we don't want them to be unduly influenced by any sort of media message. And a really interesting example of this, which you do need to know for your quiz, is the Comstock Act of 1873. Back in the 1800s, people were scared when they realized that, oh my gosh, you could send like inappropriate materials in the mail. Whoa, right? So there was actually legislation passed to make it so that any sort of and back then sexually deviant probably meant like showing somebody's ankles, um, that actually the government trying to crack down so that like society isn't corrupted by sexual deviance in snail mail. War of the Worlds broadcast, I'm not going to get into that. That was something, but you may have read about it in your book. But even more in more recent history, we have a lot of fear about things like, well, all these mass shootings that we see, is this all because of the media, right? Is it because of video games? And there's a lot of political reasons for that. I don't mean to undermine that. I mean, listen, if I was working for the NRA, there would be nothing more than I would like than to divert everybody's attention away from guns and things like that to video games, right? But at the same time, I do think there's sort of this natural fear within society about any sort of technology. It's a really easy scapegoat to blame for all sorts of things. That said, oh, sorry, actually, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I was going to say that said, I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about negative stuff, which I will. But here's another really good example of this. So there was a guy who, this is another little link you can click on and watch the video if you want. There was a moral panic about comic books back in the 1950s. And this guy Wortham was basically arguing that comic books were corrupting the youth. And excuse me, he wrote this book called Seduction of the Innocent. And he found a correlation between the amount of comic books that children read and delinquent crime. So it was making these children into hard criminals. But here's the thing. I mean, this is like a funny, this is where critical thinking skills come in. And if you ever get to take a research methods class, it would be helpful. The only people he used to study were people who were juvenile delinquents. I mean, here's the modern day equivalent. Yes, if you took, and I think I've mentioned this before, if you took all of the mass shooters in the United States and you ask them if they play video games, what you would probably find is that they do. But does that correlation mean that the video games caused them to shoot people, or is it just that everybody kind of plays video games, including mass shooters? Just like juvenile delinquents probably enjoyed a good comic book, just like kids who weren't juvenile delinquents, you know? So this is an important lesson when you're talking about any media, any negative effect of the media, because you can find them all over the place, but be cautious. Correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things tend to like go together, it doesn't mean that that one thing caused the other to happen. Sometimes the relationship can be reversed, but more often than not, there can be other variables that explain that correlation that have nothing to do with it. Like there's no correlation. Real quick, you know, I keep bringing this up, but remember, whenever you have these conversations with people about, did the media make somebody do something? Was that person just mimicking what they saw on the media? Maybe, but according to social learning theory, there's got to be some sort of motivational component, and that's usually missing. Like, even if people can mimic something, it doesn't mean that they will. So fun review. Media effects in general, you know, people like myself have been studying the media really since World War II. Media psychologists got really interested in it. And at the beginning, it's true, the assumption tended to be that, like, yes, if you put a media message on television or radio, then it's going to have this mass effect on people. But over time, everybody sort of realized that, like, the media really doesn't work like that. Most media effects are indirect, meaning it's not like you watch a media message and then all of a sudden, like, it turns your brain into mush and you're like a zombie and you just do what it says. It means that we are usually influenced through the media through something else. Down here, interpersonal communication is normally what happens, because I keep mentioning our friends are more influential than the media. So if our friends say that they want to see a movie, that is going to be more influential than if we just see a good movie trailer on TV. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like the media can affect our friends and then our friends can affect us. And that's more, that's what it's what an indirect effect looks like. Effects are also not uniform. They don't affect everybody the same way. People are different. And if you put a message out, it's going to resonate with people in different ways, and people are going to take different types of things away from the message. And media effects are usually not large. This goes back to when we were talking about social marketing. It's like you can, you know, try to persuade people to get off drugs or not to smoke or vape or whatever you want to persuade them to do. And you might persuade a few people, but you're not gonna, like, it's usually not gonna, it's gonna be a very small proportion of people. We're talking about like 2%, right? 2% of millions is still a lot of people, but relatively speaking, it's a relatively minor effect. Yeah, I'm gonna kind of skip over this and get to the meat and potatoes, but yeah, we'll skip over this for a second. Your final theory of the semester. Congratulations. And this is a pretty important media theory. It's a very well-known media theory, and it explains a lot of things that I think people talk about in general when they talk about the media. Here is what cultivation theory says. And this was a theory that was originally proposed in the 1970s. So think about the kind of media that was around back then, like broadcast media, no digital media yet, television, those types of things. And cultivation theory really is about TV watching. Cultivation theory says that over time, so hence long term, like this isn't just like a one-off, like I watched a TV show. Over time, you're watching the media, you watch a little bit each day. Over time, specifically television, media information is going to shape your perception of reality. So the way cultivation thinks about it is like there's a reality that you see on television. And this could be this is across television shows, right? Like an example would be how think about how most television shows, because they're trying to be interesting, usually have like a lot of crime in them, because that's like part of the plot. That doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of how common crime is um, in real life. Does that make sense? It's like television kind of has its own reality, but when we watch it again and again and again, that can start to shape what's actual reality, which is what's television's reality, sort of blurs together. And that's why cultivation theory says that heavy viewers of television, actually there's this mean world effect where they tend to be more suspicious and skeptical about people in the real world, because it's kind of like they're basing their judgments on the television world. And this isn't just fiction, I should point out. It's also like, think about like local news. Have you ever met somebody who's like a really heavy news consumer and they just kind of seem scared of everything? Well, I would argue that that could be a mean world effect, where television has kind of made them more uneasy because they are looking to television's version of reality. Um, the way that people like media psychologists, the way that media psychologists study cultivation theory to see if it's true or not is they have to do two steps. One step is they have to know what the media reality is. So they do what's called a content analysis. And this is literally a study of what's on the media. Like it is like picture, I mean, I'm being kind of literal here, but it's still a good, it's a good image. Picture somebody with a clipboard watching a lot of TV, and every time they see a crime, they'll be like, one crime, two crime, three crime, to actually see kind of like, okay, what's actually there? How common are crimes? And then they go and they will do surveys of people, and they will say, well, how much TV are you watching? And what do you think the chances are that you're going to be the victim of a crime? And then they see, is there a correlation between what's on TV, how much people are watching TV, and whether or not um, and how they feel about the world, how fearful they are. And I keep mentioning TV because, again, that was how the original cultivation theory was formulated, but this could be applied to any media in theory. Like you could do it with video games, or you could do it with media as a whole. Here's the problem, though. I just had this conversation about the comic books, about how correlation doesn't equal causation, right? You've got to be really skeptical. And even cultivation theory, even though there's a lot of evidence to support it, how do we know that, how I mentioned, I was like, have you ever met somebody who watches a lot of news and they seem to be more fearful of the thing? So yes, it could be there's a correlation between news consumption and fearfulness. True, but just a correlation. How do we know that it's the news media that caused people to have that perception? Couldn't it work in the other way? Could it be that people who are already a little bit more fearful want to consume news more often because it either confirms what they already believe, or it helps them survey their environment? Remember, we talked about the surveillance effect. So this is a problem with cultivation theory. It's got this correlational problem to it where we can't say definitively which comes first, right? Correlation doesn't equal causation. The only way that you can actually look at causation is if you do experiments. And that's a whole different thing, but suffice it to say, we can't do experiments because that would require like having some people who aren't exposed to media at all, and then comparing them to people who are exposed to media. But unfortunately, or okay, I don't mean to say unfortunate, but that's just not possible because everybody in society gets exposed to media. And that's exactly what this slide says. So yeah, yeah, okay. I was going to say, no, that's pretty much just what I said. And I will say another example, though, of a cultivation effect is genre effects. And some people will even debate if this is a cultivation effect or not. But, there's some evidence to suggest, for instance, that maybe people who watch a lot of romantic comedies tend to have different ideas about what a relationship should be like. Maybe they have more romantic ideals because, they've consumed a lot of film and television, maybe Hallmark movies or something that makes them feel like, oh, well, everything's supposed to be happily ever after. So it's kind of like, hence the name cultivation. All of that TV viewing has cultivated their sense of what is normal for romantic relationships and things like that. Okay, One other important thing, and this relates to also what you are going to have an option to write about on the discussion board this week if you choose to, is oops, um, did I have two? Oh, that's so weird. Okay, sorry. I don't know why this is a double slide. I will delete that before I post it. Um, is also representational issues. So another thing that can be cultivated in theory by the media is our perception of other groups. So if you've ever heard of like a stereotype, we could get an idea about like what another group is like based on watching a lot of TV. So if, let's say, a classic example of this is how Black people tend to be represented in the media. Black people tend to be represented as being violent and criminals. And this is in news and this is in entertainment. Therefore, if people watch a lot of television, they might get the idea that Black people in real life are like that, right? So that's another cultivation effect, but it could apply to any sort of group. But the other thing I want you to be aware of is that sometimes it's what's shown, sometimes it's what's not shown. An important vocabulary word is symbolic annihilation. So this is when a group is underrepresented or entirely omitted in the media. So a great example of this is older women, for instance. If you look at, I mean, this is, like a lot of things, progressively, some of these things are changing over time, but excuse me, a lot of actresses will complain that it's harder to find work in Hollywood once you're like over a certain age because people don't cast older women. There aren't as many characters on TV that are older women. Like, you've got a couple mother figures and things like that, but it's much easier to find work if you're young and pretty and, all of these things. And that's called symbolic annihilation, where it gives the impression, it cultivates the impression that this group kind of doesn't exist. In a weird way, it erases them from the media reality. And therefore, according to cultivation theory, it can kind of erase them from people's perception and actual reality. The other problem with things like that is, if people aren't able to see people who look like them in the media, then they sort of lose it affects their perception of what's possible for them. An example, and I think I had on this last slide, I would highly recommend, there's a show on Netflix called Master of None. And I think it was the first season. It's Aziz Ansari, who was a stand-up comedian. In the first season, he had a TV show, and I do show this in class, called Indians on TV. And he talks about how when he was growing up, it was hard to see like an Indian character that was anything that wasn't stereotypical, like Apu on The Simpsons or something like that. And that made him sort of feel like, he wasn't able to sort of do other things, right? Because he didn't have like role models on TV. This idea of you can't see it. If you can't see it, you can't be it. This is one theory why women lose interest in being leaders and like in politics at a younger age. It's because they don't see it as often. So the idea is like the more things that you put on the media, the more likely it is to cultivate people's perception of what's possible. And a related concept is this idea of parody. So parody is when what's in the media world equals what's in the real world. So the representations in the media represent what's actually in the actual population. So what we would say that there is parity if, for instance, however many Hispanics there are represented on TV, however many Latinx people there are, matches how frequently they are in the actual US population, which it's going to be a long time until they reach parity, this particular group in the media. Interestingly enough, Black people tend to be overrepresented in the media. Black people have exceeded parity. There are more Black people proportionately featured in the media than there are in the US population, again, proportionally. However, because most of the representations are negative, it's not necessarily a positive thing, so I don't know. Those are just some couple other things that I wanted you to know. And this concludes, if you can believe it or not, our class for now. So that's it. Now you have all of the knowledge about the media, not quite, but maybe you'll take other classes in the communication studies department on the media, and then you can learn more. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Bye.